The forest that keeps silence. The Katyn forest. For most, it is just a point on the map of the Smolensk region, a dense massif of trees not far from the Russian border. But for the history of the 20th century, it is an unhealing wound, a place where the very concept of humanity was erased by a bureaucratic stroke of a pen. Here, among the pines, lie thousands of Polish officers and civilians whose deaths were for decades the subject of the most bitter disputes, international scandals, and conspiracy theories. Even today, 85 years later, Katyn provides no peace. For a long time, the world knew two truths. The first, based on the German investigation of 1943 and documents from the special folder, declassified in the 90s, places the blame on the NKVD of the USSR. The second, which the Soviet Union defended at the Nuremberg trials, stated that the execution was the work of Nazi Germany. We are used to thinking that a final point was put in this story. In 2010, the State Duma of Russia officially recognized the responsibility of the Stalinist regime for this execution. However, history has taken a new turn. In April 2024, the FSB Directorate for the Smolensk region declassified new archival documents that again cast doubt on the official version and point to the guilt of the Nazis. This story is not just a chronicle of a murder. It is a story of how the truth becomes a hostage of geopolitics. And at the center of this story stands a man whom we already mentioned in our previous video, Vasily Blokhin. The main executioner of the Lubyanka, a man who turned execution into a conveyor belt, personally participated in the unloading of the camps that will be discussed. To understand how the flower of the Polish nation ended up in the pits of the Smolensk forest, we need to return to the darkest year of Europe, 1939. Fatal division and a trap for the elite. On August 23, 1939, a document was signed in Moscow that effectively became a death sentence for the Polish state. This was the Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But the most important thing was hidden in the secret additional protocol. Hitler and Stalin decided to redraw the map of the world. They agreed that in the event of a territorial political rearrangement, the border of interests of the two empires would pass along the line of the Nauru, Vistula, and San rivers. For the Soviet Union, these territories were not foreign. They practically coincided with the Curzon line proposed by the Entente countries back in 1919 and 1920 during the previous war. Stalin forgot nothing. On September 1st, 1939, Germany unleashed the full power of its Wehrmacht on Poland. On September 3rd, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, but it was a phony war. 110 French and British divisions stood in total inaction, while there were only 23 divisions against them on Germany's western border. Poland was left alone with catastrophe. While the Germans advanced toward Warsaw, the German ambassador to the USSR, Count von der Schulenburg, assured the Soviet leadership on September 11th that his troops would not cross the demarcation line of spheres of influence. The German side persistently hinted to Moscow. A political vacuum had arisen in Poland, and the Soviet Union must send in troops to establish order. On September 17th, 1939, Red Army forces crossed the eastern border of Poland. Official Moscow explained this with noble goals, protecting the Ukrainian and Belarusian population from the chaos caused by the collapse of the Polish state. On September 28th, a new document was signed, the Boundary and Friendship Treaty, which finally consolidated the division of the country. But the real work began not at the front, but in the rear. Following the advancing units of the RKK moved operational groups of the NKVD of the USSR. They had a surgical task: to immediately take control of communications organs, seize archives, and arrest the most reactionary representatives of society. Everyone who could become the core of resistance fell onto the arrest lists: gendarmes, police officers, intelligence and counterintelligence officers, leaders of political organizations, even white emigrant structures. In total, during the advance of the Red Army, a colossal number of people were captured. According to various estimates, from 250,000 to 389,000 Polish citizens. This was a huge mass of people who had to be kept somewhere. On September 19th, 1939, by order of the People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, number 0308, the Directorate for Prisoners of War and Internees under the NKVD of the USSR was created. It was headed by Major Pyotr Sopronenko, the head of the UPVI NKVD USSR, who directly supervised the Polish camps. 8 camps were organized: Ostashkov, Yuknov, Kozelsk, Putyval, Kozelszczyna, Starobelsk, Uzha, Oranki. Most of the rank-and-file soldiers, natives of the territories that went to the USSR, were soon released to their homes. About 40,000 residents of central and western Poland were handed over to the German side. But the elite, the officer corps, and the security structures remained in the hands of the NKVD. According to the Politburo decision of October 3, 1939, the distribution of the remaining prisoners was as follows. The Starobelsk camp in the Lugansk region took in 4,000 officers. The Kozelsk camp, located in the Optina Pustin monastery, became home to 5,000 officers. The Ostashkov camp, within the walls of the Nilo-Stolobenskaya Pustin on Lake Seliger, was intended for the most dangerous category. 4,700 gendarmes and police officers. About 28,000 more rank-and-file and junior command staff were thrown into road construction and work in the Krivoy Rog Basin. In total, 132,042 people ended up in NKVD camps. These were people whom the Soviet Union deemed suspicious. Among them were not only career military personnel, but also mobilized representatives of the intelligentsia, university professors, doctors, engineers, teachers, journalists. These people did not yet know that their fate was predetermined. They wrote letters to their relatives, which regularly reached families through the International Red Cross. They believed in international law and officers' honor. But in Moscow, a special order for considering their cases was already being prepared. And it is here that Vasily Blokhin enters history, the man who would later arrive in Kalinin with a suitcase of German pistols to personally finish what began this autumn of '39. An archipelago for officers and the trap of special order. The autumn of 1939 turned the eastern outskirts of the former Poland into a giant filtration point, while the Red Army was consolidating on the new frontiers. The bureaucratic machine of the NKVD was already working at full capacity. On September 19th, 1939, just 2 days after the start of the Polish campaign, the People's Commissar of Internal Affairs of the USSR, Lavrenti Beria, signed Order Number 0308. This document created the Directorate for Prisoners of War and Internees, abbreviated as WWII. Major Pyotr Sopronenko was appointed to the post of head of the Directorate. His name rarely appeared in the newspapers, but his role in the tragedy was fundamental. He was responsible for the functioning of the entire system of camps for Polish prisoners of war. The scale of the capture amazed even seasoned Chekists. During the advance of Soviet troops, according to various estimates, from 250,000 to 389,000 Polish citizens were taken prisoner. Most of the rank and file, simple peasants and workers mobilized into the army, were soon released home. But 130,242 people ended up in NKVD camps. These were people whom the Soviet leadership deemed suspicious and socially dangerous. The cleansing process began during the military actions. Following the advancing units of the RKK moved operational groups of the NKVD. They had two main tasks. First, the seizure of archives, authorities, and means of communication. Second, more sinister, the immediate arrest of representatives of the Polish state apparatus, gendarmes, police officers, intelligence officers, counterintelligence officers, leaders of political organizations. On October 3, 1939, the Politburo of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, made a decision that determined the structure of this camp archipelago. Rank-and-file natives of the territories that went to the USSR were released. More than 40,000 residents of Western and Central Poland were handed over to Germany. The remaining prisoners of war were distributed according to specializations. The Kozelsk camp, located in the Optina Pustin monastery, became the concentration point for 5,000 officer personnel. The Starobelsk camp in the Lugansk region took in another 4,000 Polish officers. The Ostashkov camp, located on Lake Seliger in the walls of the Nilo-Stolobenskaya Pustin, was intended for those the NKVD hated most. 4,700 police officers, gendarmes, and jailers. About 28,000 rank-and-file and junior command staff were sent to road construction and work at metallurgical enterprises. By the autumn of 1940, letters from officers in Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov suddenly stopped coming to their families. In Moscow, they started a strange game. Officers of the Polish General Staff, who were in the Gryazovets camp, those who did not show open hostility, were transferred to the capital. They were placed in Butyrka prison and at the Lubyanka, and then taken to a dacha near Moscow. There, Lavrenti Beria and Vsevolod Merkulov, Beria's deputy People's Commissar of Internal Affairs and one of the main organizers of the execution, who was part of the deciding troika, personally met with the Poles. As recalled by one of the participants in those meetings, Józef Czapski, a Polish artist and officer who survived the camps and, on the instructions of General Anders, conducted unsuccessful searches for missing comrades in the USSR. The Chekists discussed with them the creation of the core of a future Polish Red Army. It was during these conversations that the question of the missing comrades surfaced. Polish Lieutenant Colonel Zygmunt Berling, a lieutenant colonel of the Polish General Staff and one of the few officers whose lives were spared to create a pro-Soviet Polish army, reacted favorably to the idea of forming troops. No, he set a condition. All officers must enter the army regardless of their views. Berling stated directly, "In the camps in Kozelsk and Starobelsk, there are excellent personnel for this army." To which Merkulov dropped a chilling phrase, "No, not those. We made a huge mistake with them." There is another version of this conversation recorded in the report of Colonel Gorczynski. There, Beria's words sounded even more sinister. Make a list of them, however. Few of them remain, as we made a big mistake by handing most of them over to the Germans. The real crisis came after Germany's invasion of the USSR. On July 30th, 1941, the Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement was signed. It restored diplomatic relations between the USSR and Poland. On August 8th, an amnesty was declared for all Polish citizens in the USSR. The formation of the Anders Army began. On December 3rd, 1941, Stalin and Molotov met with Generals Sikorsky and Anders. Władysław Sikorski, general and head of the Polish government in exile in London, who tried to get the truth from Stalin about the fate of the officers, stated directly, "The amnesty is not being implemented. A huge number of our people are still in camps and prisons." Władysław Anders, general and creator of the Polish army on the territory of the USSR, who devoted years to searching for his missing subordinates, supported this protest. Stalin replied, "This is impossible. All Poles are released." When Anders reminded him of the list of 4,000 officers taken from the camps in the spring of the year 40, the conversation took on a grotesque character. Stalin stated, "They ran away." Anders asked, "Where could they run to?" Stalin replied, "Well, to Manchuria." General Anders, not believing these explanations, instructed the artist Józef Chapsky to go in search of the missing brothers in arms. Chapsky rushed around the country. He questioned officials. He visited camps. Everywhere he ran into a wall of silence. Later Anders wrote, "Not a single word was heard of any of the 15,000 missing prisoners since the spring of 1940. Only years later would it become known. Stalin was being untruthful. He had instructed Beria to check Sikorsky's lists. In a secret note from December 26, 1941, Beria reported, 3,320 people from the list cannot be found. Because the well-known decision of March 5, 1940, had already been made regarding them. The terrible secret of Katyn already lay in the ground, under young pines, replanted on the graves 3 years ago. The world did not yet know that in the spring of 1943, the very word Katyn would make the whole world shudder. The conveyor of death and the executioner in a leather apron. The spring of 1940 should have brought hope of liberation. But instead, it became a time of industrial destruction of thousands of human lives. By the beginning of March, preparations for the final solution of the Polish question were completed. On March 3, 1940, the People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, Lavrentiy Beria, sent a note to the Politburo under number 794/B. In it, Polish officers, police, and gendarmes were called sworn enemies of Soviet power. They were declared incorrigible and filled with hatred for the Soviet system. On March 5, 1940, the Politburo made a decision. The cases of 14,700 prisoners of war and 11,000 detainees were to be considered in a special order, without trial, without charge, with the application of the death penalty. The authority to pass sentences was assigned to a special troika. Its members included Vsevolod Merkulov, Bogdan Kozelsk, a high-ranking NKVD figure and member of the troika that issued death sentences to Polish prisoners of war, and Leonid Bashtakov, head of the 1st Special Department of the NKVD USSR, and the third member of the troika, responsible for formalizing the execution decisions. Realizing this decision required not just executors, but professionals, people capable of killing quickly, cold-bloodedly, and without failure. Such a person was Vasily Mikhailovich Blokhin, the main executioner of the Lubyanka, a man who turned execution into a production process. The most terrible place of the operation was the internal prison of the NKVD in the city of Kalinin, now Tver. It was here that prisoners from the Ostashkov camp began to be delivered, in batches of 300 and 400 people. The head of the NKVD Directorate for the Kalinin region at that time was Dmitry Tokarev, who in 1940 was the head of the NKVD Directorate for the Kalinin region, and in the 90s became a key witness describing the execution process. To organize the executions, Blokhin arrived from Moscow not alone. He was accompanied by Sinagubov and Krivenko. Moscow NKVD officials sent to Kalinin to help Blokhin organize mass executions. Blokhin brought a suitcase of German Walther pistols with him. The choice of weapon was pragmatic. Soviet Nagant revolvers overheated quickly. German Walthers allowed for continuous fire. Every evening before the start of the executions, Blokhin dressed in special equipment: a leather cap, a long leather apron, gloves with gauntlets above the elbows. This suit did not protect from the cold. It protected from blood. The process was tuned to automation. Prisoners were led one by one into the so-called Lenin room. There, their identity was checked. After that, handcuffs were put on, and they were led to a neighboring room. In the execution chamber, the walls were lined with felt to muffle the shots. The victim was made to kneel. The shot was fired into the back of the head. In the morning, the bodies were carried out through the back door and loaded into trucks, and taken to the village of Mednoy. Trenches had been dug there in advance. The bodies were buried by bulldozers. In Kharkov, the picture was repeated. There, the execution group was led by Kupri, the commandant of the NKVD Directorate in Kharkov, who led the execution group on site. Control from Moscow was carried out by Ivan Bezrukov, a captain of state security from Moscow who monitored the conduct of the executions in Kharkov. Among those killed in the Kharkov basements was Captain Jakub Wajda, the father of the future film director Andrzej Wajda. Polish generals were also shot there: Stanisław Haller, Konstanty Plisowski, and Franciszek Sikorski. The Katyn forest became the symbol of the entire operation. Here, executions were often carried out directly over the pits. The prisoners' hands were tied with a complex braided cord. Any attempt to free themselves tightened the loop around their neck. Many had their heads additionally wrapped in overcoats. A witness to the transport of victims was Stanisław Swianiewicz, a professor of economics and lieutenant, the only one who was taken off the Katyn transport at the last moment and saw the process of transporting the victims to the forest. From the platform of the Gnezdovo station, he saw buses with painted windows. They left toward the forest and returned empty. Among the executed was Janina Lewandowska, a Polish pilot and the only female officer shot in the Katyn forest. She was killed on April 22, 1940, on the day of her 32nd birthday. Some officers did not believe what was happening until the end. Major Adam Solski, a Polish major whose diary with a description of the last hours before the execution in Katyn became one of the main pieces of evidence against the NKVD, kept records until his death. His last line broke off. The watch showed 6:30. In a month and a half of the operation, 21,857 people were destroyed. Katyn, Kharkov, Kalinin, Western Ukraine, Western Belarus. It was a cold-blooded decapitation of an entire nation. An army of ghosts and the great lie of the Kremlin. The secret operation to destroy the flower of the Polish officer corps was successfully hidden under a layer of lies about escapes and difficulties of wartime. Only in the spring of 1943, when the Germans began excavations in Kozelsk, would the world understand what Stalin meant by the word mistake, and why these people would never come to the recruitment centers. For the viewer, it is important to understand. At this time, the United States was already an ally of the Soviet Union. The truth about Katyn could have destroyed this alliance at the most critical moment of the war. That is why the lie started in the Kremlin would soon receive support in Washington, where reports on the Soviet crime would be hidden in secret archives for years so as not to anger Uncle Joe. After Germany's attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the political situation changed radically. Stalin urgently needed allies, including the Polish government in exile. On July 30, 1941, the Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement was signed. It restored diplomatic relations between the USSR and Poland. Simultaneously, the formation of a Polish army began in the Soviet Union. On August 8, 1941, an amnesty was declared for Polish citizens. The wording sounded mocking. Polish officers had not committed crimes. General Władysław Anders took command of the army being created. Collection points opened all over the Soviet Union. Thousands of exhausted people flocked to them. However, it almost immediately became obvious. The officer corps from the Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov camps was practically absent in the army. Since the spring of 1940, letters from these officers had stopped arriving. 15,000 people seemed to have dissolved. Anders began a search. On his instructions, the artist and officer, Józef Chapsky, traveled to camps, prisons, and NKVD directorates. The answer was the same everywhere. People are absent. No information. The culmination occurred on December 3, 1941. A meeting between Stalin and Molotov and Generals Władysław Sikorsky and Władysław Anders took place in the Kremlin. Sikorsky stated directly, "The amnesty is not being implemented. The best officers have gone missing." Stalin made it look like he was surprised. He wrote something in a notepad and then said, "This is impossible. All Poles are released." When Anders again asked a question about specific lists, Stalin uttered the phrase that became a symbol of the lie. "They ran away." Anders asked, "Where?" Stalin replied, "To Manchuria." This explanation did not hold up to any criticism. 15,000 people could not disappear without a trace. However, the truth was already buried under the pines of the Smolensk forest. For the world, a period of silence began. Katyn became a hostage of big politics. A gift for Goebbels and the Battle of Two Commissions. The story of the Katyn burials began to surface long before the whole world learned about it. In the autumn of 1941, the headquarters of the German 537th Signal Regiment, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Ahrens, was located in Kozy Gori, at a former NKVD dacha. Ahrens was a German signal colonel, whose headquarters was in Katyn, and whom the Soviet side tried to accuse of organizing the executions. But his innocence was proven at Nuremberg. Ahrens later recalled that he received information about some soldier graves near the headquarters. But at first, he did not give it any significance. However, already in May 1942, Polish workers from the German construction organization TOT, trusting the indications of local resident Parfion Kiselyov, a local resident of Katyn who was the first to point out the burial sites to the Polish workers and the Germans, dug up one of the graves. They found the remains of people in Polish military uniforms and, obeying a Christian duty, placed birch crosses over them. A real political explosion occurred in early 1943. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, Nazi Germany was in desperate need of a reputational revenge. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary that now the war in the East required not only tanks, but also big politics. The Katyn burials became a rare gift of fate for him. Goebbels planned to use this discovery as a colossal political bomb, capable of driving a wedge between the Soviet Union and its Western allies. On March 29, 1943, the official exhumation began. On April 13th, Berlin radio officially announced the discovery of thousands of Polish officers executed by the NKVD. This was the start of a large-scale propaganda campaign. Moscow reacted 3 days later, publishing a summary of the Soviet Information Bureau under the title, "Vile Fabrications of the German Fascist Executioners." The Soviet version stated, Polish prisoners in the summer of 1941 worked on roads west of Smolensk, did not have time to evacuate, and were shot by the Germans who captured them. International expertise and evidence from the ground. To make the world believe the German version, Hitler took an unprecedented step. He proposed creating an independent commission of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Polish government in exile supported this idea. Stalin blocked the work of the Red Cross, stating that the organization could not operate on Soviet territory without his consent. In response to the Polish requests, the Soviet Union simply broke off diplomatic relations with them. The Germans had to form a commission from representatives of countries allied to them and doctors from neutral Switzerland. In the exhumation, led by Professor Gerhard Butz, a German professor of medicine who led the first large-scale exhumation and international expertise in Katyn in the year 43. The Technical Commission of the Polish Red Cross also took part. By June 7th, 4,143 corpses had been extracted from 8 mass graves. The evidence gathered by Butz's commission was damning. Clothing and seasonality. 70% of the bodies were identified. The victims from the first 7 graves wore warm winter clothing, overcoats, fur jackets, sweaters, and scarves. In the pockets, newspapers from March and April, 1,940 were found. The absence of traces of blowflies confirmed that the burial was carried out during the cold time of year. Personal belongings. A huge number of diaries, letters, handmade snuff boxes, and mouthpieces with carved inscriptions Kozelsk and dates 1939 or 1940 were found. All documents broke off on the date May 6, 1940. Method of execution. All victims were killed by a shot to the back of the head from German pistols of 7.65 mm caliber. The Germans explained that these Gecko brand cartridges were exported en masse to the USSR in the 1920s. Specific traces. The hands of young officers were tied with a complex braided cord so that any attempt to free themselves tightened the loop around their neck. Traces of strikes from a Soviet 4-edged bayonet were found on the bodies, which was used to prod people to the edge of the pit. The Soviet answer. The Burdenko Commission. After the liberation of Smolensk in October 1943, the Soviet government began a counteroffensive in the information field. First, a special commission of the NKVD and NKGB worked in Katyn, whose goal, according to modern investigations, was to find graves not examined by the Germans and prepare false witnesses. On January 12, 1944, the official Burdenko Commission was created under the chairmanship of Nikolai Burdenko, the chief surgeon of the Red Army, who headed the Soviet commission that tried to shift the blame for the execution onto the Germans. In 5 days of work, the commission exhumed 925 corpses. The final report claimed that the Poles were shot by a German institution, the headquarters of the 537th Construction Battalion, led by Oberleutnant Arnes in August and September of 1941. The Burdenko Commission claimed it found documents on the bodies with dates later than the spring of the year 40. However, a subsequent investigation by the main military prosecutor's office of Russia in the 90s proved that these documents were the fruit of direct falsification. Part of the genuine Polish graves were destroyed at the same time, and the skulls of the generals were taken for Burdenko's collection. Katyn in Nuremberg, a juridical impasse. At the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946, the Soviet prosecution tried to officially consolidate Germany's guilt for Katyn by including this episode in the indictment against Hermann Göring. The Soviet side expected the tribunal to accept the materials of the Burdenko Commission without discussion, as official data from the Allies. However, Göring's defense, relying on the advice of American experts such as Fabian von Schlabrendorf, convinced the court to hear witnesses. This caused shock among Soviet prosecutors. In the end, the court heard 3 witnesses from each side. On behalf of the USSR, astronomer Boris Basilevsky and Bulgarian expert Markov spoke. Markov, after his arrest in communist Bulgaria, suddenly changed his views and began to criticize the German commission that he himself had previously signed. The main witness for the defense was Friedrich Ahrens himself. The Soviet commission persistently called him the organizer of the execution's Arnes. It was proven to the court that Ahrens arrived in Katyn only in November 1941, 2 months after the date of execution indicated in the Soviet report. Furthermore, he commanded a signal regiment, not a punitive construction battalion. As a result, the International Military Tribunal did not support the Soviet prosecution. In the final judgment of Nuremberg, the Katyn massacre is simply absent. This became the first major defeat for the Soviet version on the international stage. But the official recognition of the truth by Moscow was delayed for long decades. American investigation, recognition, and the echo of Katyn in the 21st century. After the Nuremberg tribunal left the Katyn case without a final verdict, a shadow of long silence hung over this tragedy. However, for American society, the story was only beginning. In the early 50s, when the Cold War was in full swing, the United States undertook the most large-scale attempt to get to the truth. Investigation by the U.S. Congress, the Madden Commission. In 1951, a special committee of the House of Representatives of the U.S. Congress on Katyn was created under the chairmanship of Ray Madden, an American congressman and chairman of the U.S. Commission that in the 50s was the first in the West to officially recognize the guilt of the USSR. This was a time when Washington no longer considered Stalin an ally, and the truth could become a powerful weapon against Soviet ideology. The conclusion of the Madden Commission was unambiguous. The Soviet Union was guilty of the Katyn murder. The congressman highlighted several key signs of Moscow's guilt. The fierce opposition of the Soviet Union to the international investigation of the Red Cross in 1943. The refusal to invite neutral observers during the work of the Burdenko Commission. Even the foreign correspondents present there assess the action as an entirely organized show. The total inability of the Soviet side to present sufficient evidence of German guilt in Nuremberg. The fact that Stalin, Molotov, and Beria lied impudently to the Poles until the spring of 1943, stating that they did not know the location of the officers. The Madden Commission proposed bringing the results of the investigation to public discussion in the United Nations, to convene an international tribunal. But the White House did not support this initiative. Why? Documents declassified in 2012 provided the answer. The U.S. President's administration was sure of Soviet guilt from the very beginning, but kept it a secret for political reasons. Back in 1943, President Roosevelt received materials from British Prime Minister Churchill regarding the investigation of Ambassador Owen O'Malley, the British ambassador who provided Roosevelt with a report on the undeniable guilt of the Soviets back in '43. In 1944, Roosevelt's special emissary George Earle, the American special envoy to the Balkans whose report on the USSR's guilt in Katyn was classified by President Roosevelt, conducted his own investigation. And he came to the same conclusions. But Roosevelt personally forbade Earle from publishing the report, putting it under wraps. In the same way, reports from American prisoners of war whom the Germans took to Katyn in 1943 were hidden. The era of Glasnost. When the walls spoke. A real breakthrough began only during the years of Perestroika. A Soviet-Polish commission of scholars on difficult issues began its work in the USSR. The Polish part of the commission, relying on the policy of Glasnost, demanded the presentation of documents, although Soviet historians at first refused to change the official version. In December 1987, a secret Note of the Four was prepared. In it, Alexander Yakovlev, Eduard Shevardnadze, and other high-ranking officials proposed that the country's leadership finally recognize the guilt of the Stalinist regime. In the summer of 1989, historian Yuri Zoriya, a Soviet historian who during the years of Perestroika was the first to find archival evidence by comparing NKVD transport lists with German lists of graves, made a discovery that was impossible to ignore. He compared the NKVD lists of prisoners departing from the Kozelsk camp with the exhumation lists from the German White Paper. It turned out they were the same people. Even the order of their lying in the graves coincided with the order of their dispatch from the camp. KGB head Kryuchkov tried to hush up this investigation, but the truth was already leaking out. Parallel to this, in Kharkov and Kalinin, other execution sites began to open up. Back in 1969, school children in the village of Piatykatsky near Kharkov found graves in the forest with Polish buttons and insignia. Then, the KGB authorities tried in a panic to again classify and destroy the burials. But they failed to erase the memory of the local residents. In 1990, official excavations began in Piatykatsky and Mednoye. On April 13, 1990, the Soviet Union officially recognized responsibility for the Katyn massacre through a special TSS statement. It stated that the death of the Polish officers was the work of Beria, Merkulov, and their subordinates. Mikhail Gorbachev personally handed over the transport lists from the three camps to Polish President Jaruzelski. Packet number 1 and the return of Vasily Blokhin. The main evidence was kept for decades in the secret special folder of the archive of the CPSU Central Committee. Boris Yeltsin received this packet number 1 personally from Gorbachev during the transfer of power. On September 24, 1992, the packet was opened. It contained the originals of Beria's note and the Politburo decision of March 5, 1940, regarding the execution. Expertise confirmed the authenticity of the documents. It was revealed that the first sheets of Beria's note were typed on one NKVD typewriter, while the last sheet was on another. This allowed for the restoration of the chain of events. The transport by trains in groups of 350 to 400 people began in April 1940. It is here that the name of Vasily Blokhin resurfaces in the materials of criminal case number 159. In 1991, the former head of the Kalinin NKVD Directorate, Dmitry Tokarev, who in 1940 was the head of the NKVD Directorate for the Kalinin region, and in the 90s became a key witness describing the execution process. gave all the details about the role of Blokhin during interrogation at the main military prosecutor's office. Blokhin personally led the mass execution of the Ostashkov camp prisoners in the Katyn prison. He brought a suitcase of German Walter pistols with him, and he wore his famous leather apron so as not to get dirty with blood. Every night, the corpses were taken to Mednoy and buried by bulldozers. At the same time in Kharkov, Commandant Kupri and Moscow curator Bezrukov led similar executions of Starobelsk camp prisoners. Modern reality and new disputes. In 2004, the main military prosecutor's office of Russia closed the case due to the death of the perpetrators. Of the 183 volumes of the criminal case, 116 were classified, which caused indignation on the Polish side. Relatives of the deceased filed a complaint with the European Court of Human Rights. In 2013, the Grand Chamber of the ECHR recognized the execution as a war crime. But it noted that it could not consider the case on its merits because the convention does not have retroactive effect. Despite the fact that Presidents Putin and Medvedev repeatedly condemned Katyn as a crime of the Stalinist regime, in recent years, the situation has begun to change. In 2022, the flag of Poland was demonstratively removed from the memorial complex in Katyn. In April 2024, the FSB Directorate for the Smolensk region declassified new documents that again cast doubt on the guilt of the NKVD. The scientific director of the Russian Military Historical Society, Mikhail Myakov, the scientific director of the RVIO, who in 2024 spoke in favor of reviewing the responsibility of the NKVD, stated, "The version of the guilt of the Soviet authorities cannot be unequivocally accepted." He again cited arguments about the German cartridges and paper twine, although these arguments were refuted back in the 90s by the testimony of Chekists like Tokarev and archival findings. Today, in 2026, Katyn remains not just a monument to the fallen, but a field of battle for history. For the American viewer, this is an example of how a state machine can commit a crime, hide it for half a century, and even after recognizing the truth, try to turn everything back. This is a story about how dictatorships have no statute of limitations, and the truth always finds its defenders and opponents.